The bells had not even finished ringing when Alira saw it. A small mark, glowing faintly silver, rising just beneath her sister's collarbone. It was the kind of mark that only appeared for one reason: a bonding mark, a mate mark. And it was forming on Ren, her own sister, standing 3 steps behind her at the altar, holding the flowers Alira was supposed to carry down the aisle only minutes before. Alira's hands went cold. She turned her head, slowly, toward the man standing beside her, Corwin Dre. Her fiancé, the man she had known since childhood, the man her father had promised her 2 years ago, the man the entire Vantosh pack had gathered here today to watch her marry. His eyes were not on her, they were on Ren, and in them, Alira saw something she had never let herself imagine before this exact moment. Hunger, belonging, the unmistakable look of a wolf who has already found his mate, and it was not her. The priest was still speaking. Somewhere behind her, someone coughed. A child laughed at the back of the hall, unaware that the world at the front of the room had just cracked open. Alira did not scream. She did not cry out or accuse him in front of 300 guests, though every part of her wanted to. She simply stood there, feeling the silk of her wedding dress suddenly too tight around her ribs, feeling her own heartbeat pound so loudly she was certain the whole room could hear it. She looked at Corwin's face and understood, with a terrible clarity, that this was not new. This had likely been happening for weeks, maybe longer, and nobody had told her. Her sister would not meet her eyes. That was the detail that broke something loose inside her chest. Ren, who had braided her hair every morning since they were children, who had cried with joy when Alira first announced her engagement, who had promised to stand right behind her today as her witness. Ren could not even look at her. The priest asked if anyone objected to the union. Silence stretched through the hall, thick and suffocating. Alira could have said something then. She could have torn the veil from her head and shouted the truth for every noble family present to hear. Instead, she felt her body move on its own, stepping back from the altar, one slow step, then another, the fabric of her gown dragging against the stone floor. Corwin's head snapped toward her. "Alira, don't," she said quietly. Her voice did not shake, though she felt as if everything inside her was shaking at once. "Don't say my name like that. Not here. Not after this." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone stood. A chair scraped against stone. Her father, seated in the front row, rose halfway out of his seat, his face pale with confusion, not yet understanding what his daughter had seen. Alira looked once more at her sister. Ren's lips parted, as if to explain, to apologize, to say something that could possibly undo what had just been revealed in front of an entire pack. But no words came, and in that silence, Alira understood that there was nothing Ren could say that would matter. She turned and ran. She did not look back at the gasps behind her, did not look back at Corwin calling her name with a mixture of panic and guilt in his voice, did not look back at her father shouting for someone to stop her. She lifted the heavy skirts of her wedding gown and ran down the aisle, past rows of stunned faces, through the enormous double doors of the ceremonial hall, and out into the cold afternoon air. The forest was close. It was always close, in Vantosh territory, thick, old, and largely untouched, forming a natural wall around the pack's lands. Alira did not think about where she was going. She only knew she needed to be anywhere that was not that hall, anywhere that Corwin's eyes were not on her sister instead of her. Branches caught at her dress as she ran, tearing delicate lace, but she did not slow down. Somewhere behind her she heard voices calling, but they grew fainter with every step, swallowed by the trees. Her lungs burned. Her chest ached with something far worse than exhaustion. She had known Corwin since she was 11 years old. She had loved him, or thought she had, for most of her life. She had imagined, the way young girls do, a future full of small, quiet mornings, and a family of her own. She had never imagined this. She had never imagined standing at her own wedding and watching the man she was about to marry look at her sister the way a wolf looks at the one person meant only for him. She did not know how long she ran. The forest blurred into shapes of gray and green, the sound of her own breathing louder than anything else in the world. Eventually her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed at the base of an old, twisted tree, her wedding dress ruined, her carefully arranged hair falling loose around her shoulders. For a long moment, she simply sat there, staring at nothing. Then the tears came. Not the elegant, quiet tears she had always imagined shedding on her wedding day out of joy. These were rough, broken sobs that shook her entire body, the kind that came from somewhere deep and old, a place that had been holding on far too tightly for far too long. She cried for the wedding that would never happen. She cried for the years she had spent believing Corwin was hers. She cried, more than anything, for her sister, for the years of trust that now felt like nothing more than a carefully built illusion. She did not know how long she sat there before she noticed the forest had gone quiet. Too quiet. The birds that had been calling overhead just moments ago had stopped. The wind, which had been rustling steadily through the leaves, seemed to hold its breath. Alira lifted her head, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, and felt something she had not felt since she was a child wandering too far from home, the unmistakable sense of being watched. She was not in Vantosh territory anymore. She realized this with a sudden, sharp jolt of fear. Somewhere in her blind running, she had crossed the old boundary line, the one every child in her pack was warned never to cross. The line that separated Vantosh land from the territory of their oldest rivals, the White Wolves. Alira scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering now for an entirely different reason. Stories about the White Wolf pack had followed her since childhood, stories of a fierce, unforgiving kingdom ruled by a king whose temper was said to be as cold and merciless as winter itself. Stories meant to keep children close to home and far from the border. She turned to run back the way she had come, but stopped short. A wolf stood between her and the direction she needed to go. He was massive, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, his fur a pale, almost luminous white that seemed to catch even the dim forest light and turn it silver. His eyes, fixed directly on her, were a striking shade of ice blue, sharp and intelligent in a way that made her stomach twist. He did not growl, he did not lunge, he simply stood there, still as stone, studying her the way a predator studies something it has not yet decided whether to consider prey or something else entirely. Alira's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the legends of the White Wolf King, the way he could shift between his wolf form and his human form as easily as breathing, the way his temper was rumored to have ended more than one dispute before it could even begin. She had never expected to meet him like this, barefoot, in a ruined wedding gown, tears still drying on her face, standing alone in the middle of enemy territory, with absolutely no way to defend herself. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice trembling, despite her best effort to steady it. "I did not mean to cross into your lands. I was not thinking. I will leave immediately." The wolf tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, to her astonishment, his form began to shift, bones rearranging with a low, unsettling sound, white fur receding into pale skin, until standing before her was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in dark travel clothes that did nothing to hide the quiet authority radiating from him. His hair was the same startling white as his wolf form, and his eyes had lost none of their sharpness in human form. "You are Vantosh," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, measured, carrying the kind of calm that felt more dangerous than any shout could have been. "Your scent gives you away. What is a Vantosh woman doing alone on White Wolf land, dressed like she has just run from her own wedding?" Alira's chin lifted, some old stubborn pride refusing to let her crumble further in front of a stranger, even one who could likely end her life without much effort. "Because I have," she said. "I ran from my own wedding. Is that a crime on your land, as well as mine?" Something flickered across his expression, not quite amusement, but close to it. "That depends," he said. "On why?" Alira hesitated. She did not owe this man, this enemy king, any explanation at all. And yet something about the directness of his question, the lack of pity in his voice, made the truth spill out of her before she could stop it. "My fiancé marked my sister," she said, "at the altar, in front of our entire pack. I saw it happening while I stood beside him in my wedding dress." The White Wolf King was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "That is not a small betrayal." "No," Alira agreed, her voice breaking slightly despite herself. "It is not." He studied her for another long moment, his ice blue eyes moving over her ruined gown, her tear-streaked face, the torn hem of what should have been the happiest dress she ever wore. There was no cruelty in his gaze, no mockery, only a kind of careful, assessing curiosity, as if he were solving a puzzle he had not expected to encounter today. "You should not be here," he said finally. "Not because I intend to hurt you. Because if my scouts find a Vantosh woman on our land before I decide what to do with her, they will not ask questions first." Alira's pulse spiked. "Then let me leave, please." "I will escort you to the border myself," he said. "It is the safest way. My name is Kale Ashwinter. Some call me the White Wolf King. You may as well know whose land you were foolish enough to wander into." "Alira," she said quietly. "Alira Vantosh." Something shifted in his expression again at the sound of her name. Recognition, perhaps, or simple confirmation of what he had already guessed. He said nothing more about it, only turned and began walking, gesturing for her to follow. They walked in silence through the darkening forest, the last light of the afternoon slipping away between the trees. Alira kept a careful distance behind him, her mind spinning with everything that had happened in the span of a single hour. Her wedding, her sister's betrayal, her flight through the forest, and now this strange, quiet walk beside the most feared king in the region, a man she had been raised to fear since she could first understand the word enemy. And yet, walking behind him through the fading light, she did not feel afraid. She felt, for the first time all day, strangely and unexpectedly calm. When they finally reached the border, the old stone markers rising up from the underbrush like silent sentries, Kale stopped and turned to face her. "This is where our lands end," he said. "From here, you will find your way home easily enough." Alira looked past him, toward the direction of Vantosh territory, toward the pack hall where her father was likely still trying to calm 300 confused guests, toward the home where her sister was likely still wearing the mark that had shattered everything Alira believed her life would be. She did not want to go back. "Thank you," she said instead, turning to face him fully, "for not hurting me, for walking me back." Kale inclined his head slightly, the gesture almost formal despite the strangeness of the entire encounter. "Go home, Alira Vantosh," he said. "Whatever waits for you there, it is better faced than avoided." He turned and disappeared back into the trees before she could respond, his white form melting seamlessly into the shadows of the forest. Alira stood at the border for a long moment, staring after him, her ruined wedding dress hanging heavy and cold around her, her heart still racing from everything the day had brought. She thought of her sister's mark. She thought of Corwin's eyes, full of a hunger that had never once been meant for her. She thought of the calm, steady voice of a king she had been taught her entire life to fear. And for reasons she could not yet explain to herself, it was his voice that stayed with her the longest, as she finally turned and began the long walk home. By the time Alira reached the edge of Vantosh territory, night had fully settled over the packlands. Torches burned along the main path leading to her family's estate, and even from a distance, she could hear the low hum of voices. Servants, guards, and pack members still gathered near the ceremonial hall, discussing what had happened only hours earlier. She hesitated at the tree line, watching the lights flicker against the stone walls of her home. Somewhere inside, her father was likely pacing, furious and humiliated in front of the entire pack. Somewhere inside, Corwin was likely trying to explain himself, and Ren was likely hiding from the consequences of a truth she had let unfold in silence. Alira squared her shoulders and walked forward. The guards at the gate startled at the sight of her, barefoot, her wedding gown torn and stained with dirt, her hair falling loose and tangled around her face. One of them called out for someone inside, and within moments, her father appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of relief and barely restrained anger. "Where have you been?" Ulrich Vantosh demanded, striding across the courtyard toward her. "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand the position you have put this family in?" "The position I have put this family in?" Alira repeated, disbelief sharpening her voice. "Father, did you not see what happened at that altar? Did you not see the mark on Ren's neck?" Her father's jaw tightened, and in that single moment of hesitation, Alira understood the truth before he even spoke it. "You knew," she said quietly. "I did not know until this morning," he admitted, his voice lower now, almost defeated. "Corwin came to me before the ceremony. He told me everything, about the bond forming between him and Ren, about how it had happened without either of their consent, the way true mate bonds sometimes do. There was no time to stop the wedding without causing a scandal that could have destroyed this pack's standing with the Drav family. "So you let me walk down that aisle," Illyra said, her voice rising now, knowing what I would see, knowing what would happen the moment that bond fully formed. "I hoped it could wait," her father said. "I hoped the ceremony could be finished before anyone noticed." I was wrong. Illyra felt something cold settle deep in her chest, colder even than the humiliation of the altar itself. Her own father had known. He had chosen the pack's alliance with the Dre family over his own daughter's dignity. "Where is Ren?" Illyra asked. "In her room," her father said. "She has not stopped crying since you ran. Illyra, please understand, none of this was her intention." "Do not," Illyra said sharply, cutting him off. "Do not ask me to feel sympathy for her right now. I stood at that altar in my wedding dress and watched my own sister receive a mark from my fiancé. I do not care what she intended. I care what happened." Her father said nothing further, and Illyra pushed past him into the house, ignoring the concerned glances of the servants she passed. She made her way to her own room, locked the door behind her, and finally allowed herself to sink onto the edge of her bed, the weight of the entire day pressing down on her all at once. She did not sleep that night. She sat awake for hours, staring at the ruined wedding gown draped over her chair, thinking of her sister's silence, her father's admission, and, though she tried not to dwell on it, the strange, steady voice of the White Wolf King, who had walked her safely to the border without asking for anything in return. By morning, word had spread through the entire pack. Illyra could hear it in the hushed whispers of the servants, could see it in the sideways glances of pack members she passed in the halls. The betrayed bride, the runaway fiancé. Some pitied her, others, she suspected, quietly blamed her for embarrassing the family by fleeing, rather than accepting the situation with grace. She was summoned to her father's study shortly after midday. When she arrived, she found not only her father waiting for her, but Corwin as well, standing near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully composed. "Leave us," Illyra said to her father, her eyes fixed on Corwin. Her father hesitated, then nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Corwin broke the silence. "Illyra, I need you to understand." "You do not need me to understand anything," Illyra interrupted. "I understand perfectly well. You bonded with my sister. Whether it happened by choice or by fate does not change the fact that you allowed our wedding to continue anyway, knowing what waited for me at that altar." "I did not know how to stop it," Corwin said, his voice strained. "The alliance between our families has been planned for years. I hoped, that once the wedding was finished, we could find some way to manage the situation quietly." "Manage the situation," Illyra repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "You mean you hoped to marry me while keeping my sister as your true mate in secret?" Corwin flinched, but did not deny it. Illyra felt something inside her go very still, very calm, in the way that only comes after the worst of the anger has already burned through. "I will not be part of that arrangement," she said. "I will not spend my life as a convenient wife while you and my sister share something I was never given the chance to have." "Illyra, the wedding is over, Corwin," she said. "Whatever exists between you and Ren, that is between the two of you now. I want no part of it." She turned and left the study without waiting for his response, her heart pounding, but her resolve steady in a way it had not been the previous day. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the Vantosh household remained tense and strained. Ren attempted to speak with Illyra twice, and both times, Illyra refused to open her door. She was not yet ready to hear apologies, not yet ready to untangle whatever guilt or grief her sister carried. She needed time, and more than that, she needed distance. It was nearly a week later, during a quiet evening walk along the edge of the estate gardens, that Illyra overheard a conversation that would change the course of everything that followed. Two of the senior pack elders were speaking near the garden wall, unaware of her presence in the shadows nearby. "The Drawe family will expect a new arrangement," one of them murmured. "Perhaps young Ren will take her sister's place as Corwin's bride, now that the bond has formed." Alaric will likely agree, the other elder replied. It preserves the alliance and spares the family further embarrassment, though I imagine it will not sit well with Elira. Elira's feelings are hardly the priority here, the first elder said dismissively. The alliance with the Dray pack has always mattered more than any one daughter's happiness. She will understand that eventually, or she will not, and either way, the pack's interests come first. Elira stood frozen in the shadows, listening to her own worth being weighed and dismissed so casually, so completely, by men who had known her since she was a child. It was not the cruelty of the words that struck her hardest. It was the certainty in their voices, the absolute confidence that her feelings, her dignity, her future, mattered less than a political alliance. She walked away from the garden that night with a clarity she had not possessed since the moment she fled the altar. She would not stay and watch her sister take her place as Corwin's wife, while she remained unmarried, pitied, and increasingly irrelevant within her own family's plans. She would not wait quietly for her father to arrange some new, lesser future for her, simply to smooth over the humiliation of the broken wedding. She thought, unexpectedly, of the White Wolf King. She thought of his calm voice, his steady gaze, the way he had not mocked her, or pitied her, only studied her with a kind of careful curiosity she had not encountered from anyone within her own pack. She thought of the rumors surrounding him, a king forced into his own unwanted political marriage, a king whose enemies sought to use his need for an alliance against him. An idea began to form in her mind, reckless and bold, in a way that felt entirely unlike the careful, obedient daughter she had always been. If her family intended to trade her future for political convenience, then perhaps she would do the same, on her own terms, with her own choice, using the very alliance her family feared most. The following morning, Elira packed a small bag with essential belongings, left before dawn while the household still slept, and made her way back toward the border she had crossed only days earlier. Her heart pounded with every step, uncertain whether she was walking toward salvation or disaster. But for the first time since the wedding, she felt something other than grief. She felt purpose. The forest was quieter this time, the morning light filtering gently through the canopy above as she made her way toward the old stone markers that separated Vantosh land from White Wolf territory. She did not know if Cale Ashwinter would remember her, did not know if he would even agree to see her, let alone consider the proposal forming more clearly in her mind with every step she took. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised even herself, that she could not go back to the life waiting for her within her father's house. When she reached the border, she found it eerily quiet, the forest around her still and watchful in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. She stepped carefully past the stone markers, further into White Wolf territory than she had ever intended to venture, and called out into the trees. "Cale Ashwinter," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I need to speak with you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows between the trees, a familiar pale shape emerged, shifting smoothly into the tall, white-haired figure she remembered from days before. "You are either very brave," Cale said, studying her with those same sharp, ice-blue eyes, "or very foolish, to return to my land uninvited a second time." "Perhaps both," Elira admitted. "But I have a proposal for you, and I believe it is one that benefits us both." Cale's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing the wary caution from moments before. "I am listening," he said. Elira took a steadying breath and began. "I know what is being said about you across the region," Elira began, standing straight, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "That the neighboring alphas are pressing you toward a marriage you did not choose, meant to weaken your throne and tie your kingdom to families who see you only as a means to expand their own influence." Cale's expression did not change, but something in his stillness told her she had struck close to the truth. "You have been asking questions," he said. "I have been listening," Elira corrected. "Word travels faster than people realize, even across enemy borders. And I imagine a king as careful as you are does not want a marriage forced upon him any more than I want to return to a family who has already decided to replace me with my own sister." "You want to marry me," Cale said flatly, as though testing the shape of the words. "A woman who, only days ago, ran from her own wedding in tears. I want to marry you for the same reason you may want to marry me, Alara said, refusing to let his tone rattle her resolve. Because it solves a problem for both of us. You need a marriage that strengthens your position rather than weakens it. My family intends to hand me nothing but pity and a lesser future, while my sister takes the place that was meant to be mine. If I marry the White Wolf King, my family's alliance with the Drapac becomes far less important than the fact that their disgraced, discarded daughter has become queen of their oldest rival. For a long moment, Kale said nothing, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself not to. Finally he spoke. You understand this would not be a marriage built on affection, he said. It would be a political arrangement, nothing more. I understand perfectly, Alara said. I am not asking for affection. I am asking for a partnership. Protection, a title, and the means to build a life that is entirely my own, free of my family's expectations. In exchange, you gain a wife whose bloodline, however currently disgraced in the eyes of my own pack, still carries enough standing to satisfy whatever alliance requirements are being pushed upon you. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the trees as though weighing the proposal carefully. The Alphas pressing this marriage upon me expect someone chosen from within their own circles, he said finally. Someone they can influence. A Vantosh bride, especially one who has already defied her own family so publicly, would not be so easily controlled. Exactly, Alara said, which means you get the protection of a political marriage without surrendering any real power to those trying to use it against you. Kale studied her for a long moment longer, and Alara held his gaze steadily, refusing to let the weight of what she was proposing show on her face, even as her heart pounded with uncertainty. You are asking me to trust a stranger, Kale said finally. A woman from an enemy pack, whose only true qualification is that she has nothing left to lose. I am asking you to make a strategic decision, Alara corrected. The same kind of decision I imagine you make every day as king, nothing more. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the quiet rustle of wind moving through the trees. Alara waited, refusing to fill the silence with nervous explanation, refusing to let him see just how much rested on his answer. Finally, Kale spoke. If we do this, he said, there will be conditions. You will learn our ways, our laws, and you will represent this kingdom with the dignity it deserves. There will be no half measures, no quiet retreat back to your family's lands, if the arrangement grows difficult. I have no intention of retreating anywhere, Alara said firmly. I have nowhere left to retreat to. Something shifted in Kale's expression then, not quite warmth, but a kind of grudging respect that had not been present before. Very well, he said. I will speak with my council. If they agree the arrangement is sound, we will proceed. Alara felt a rush of something complicated move through her chest. Relief, uncertainty, and a strange, quiet thrill she did not fully understand. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me yet, Kale said, turning to lead her deeper into his territory. You have not yet seen what awaits you as Queen of the White Wolves. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and negotiation. Kale's council, a group of stern, watchful advisors who eyed Alara with open suspicion, debated the proposal extensively before finally agreeing that a marriage to a disgraced Vantosh daughter carried far less risk than the political entanglements being pushed by the neighboring Alphas. Word was sent to Alara's father, informing him of her decision, and though a messenger returned, with an angry, disbelieving letter demanding her immediate return, Alara remained resolute. She would not go back. The wedding, when it finally took place, bore almost no resemblance to the grand, elaborate ceremony that had ended so disastrously only weeks before. There were no hundreds of guests, no carefully arranged flowers, no aisle stretching toward a future she had once believed in completely. Instead, the ceremony was small, formal, and quiet, held within the great hall of the White Wolf territory, attended only by Kale's closest advisors and a handful of pack elders whose approval was required to formalize the union. Alara stood beside Kale in a simple, elegant gown of pale silver, her hair pulled back in a style far less elaborate than the one she had worn weeks earlier. As the ceremonial words were spoken, binding her officially as Queen of the White Wolves, She felt none of the joy she had once imagined feeling on her wedding day, but she felt something else instead. A quiet, steady sense of control over her own future, something she had not felt in a very long time. When the ceremony ended, Cale turned to face her, his expression unreadable as always. "It is done," he said simply. "Welcome to White Wolf territory, Elira Ashwinter." The sound of her new name settled strangely in her chest, not quite comfortable, not yet entirely foreign either. That evening, as servants prepared her new chambers within the castle, Elira found herself standing alone on a balcony, overlooking the vast, moonlit forest that stretched endlessly beyond the castle walls. The air was colder here than it had been in Vantosh territory, sharper somehow, carrying the distinct scent of pine and frost even in the warmer months. She thought of her sister, likely already preparing to step into the role that had once been meant for Elira, likely already being fitted for a wedding gown of her own. She thought of her father, furious and humiliated by her decision, and of the pack elders who had so casually dismissed her feelings only days before. She did not regret her choice. Whatever uncertainty waited for her within these unfamiliar walls, it was infinitely preferable to the quiet, diminished future that had been planned for her back home. A soft knock sounded at the door behind her, and she turned to find Cale standing in the doorway, still dressed in the formal attire from the ceremony, though he had removed the heavier ceremonial cloak. "You are not sleeping," he observed, stepping onto the balcony beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. "It has been a long day," Elira said. "A long few weeks, if I am honest." Cale was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the same moonlit forest she had been studying. "I imagine it has," he said finally. "For what it is worth, you handled yourself with more composure today than most of my own advisors expected." Elira glanced at him, surprised by the small, unexpected compliment. "Is that meant to reassure me?" "It is meant as the truth," Cale said simply. "Whatever else this arrangement is, I do not intend to lie to you, Elira. We may not have married for affection, but we are bound together now regardless. I would rather build something honest between us than something built on false comfort." Something in his words settled a small, steady warmth in her chest, unexpected amid the uncertainty of the day. "I would rather that as well," she said quietly. They stood together in silence for a while longer, watching the wind move gently through the distant treetops, two strangers bound together by circumstance and strategy, neither of them yet aware of how quickly the careful boundaries they had built between them would begin to shift in the days that followed. Finally, Cale turned to leave, pausing briefly at the door. "Rest, if you can," he said. "Tomorrow, you begin learning what it means to rule beside me. It will not be easy." "I did not expect it to be," Elira said. A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Elira found herself watching it, long after he had disappeared back into the castle, wondering, for the first time since fleeing her own wedding, what exactly her future among the White Wolves would truly become. News of the marriage spread across the region faster than Elira had anticipated, and the reaction was immediate and fierce. Within days, messengers arrived from 3 separate territories, each carrying formal letters of protest addressed to Cale, questioning the wisdom of binding his kingdom to a disgraced daughter of a rival pack. Elira read the letters herself, since Cale insisted she be informed of everything concerning her new position, and she felt the weight of every dismissive word directed at her. "They call me an embarrassment," she said one afternoon, setting down a particularly harsh letter from one of the neighboring alphas, who had hoped to arrange Cale's marriage himself. "They say you have made a foolish choice." "They say many things," Cale replied, barely glancing up from the reports spread across his desk. "Most of what they say matters very little. What matters is whether the choice strengthens this kingdom, and so far it has." Elira studied him carefully, trying to determine whether his calm indifference was genuine or simply another carefully maintained mask. In the weeks since the wedding, she had begun to notice small details about her new husband that the rumors surrounding him had never mentioned. The careful, methodical way he reviewed every report brought before him, the quiet respect his advisors showed him, despite his reputation for coldness, the rare moments when his guarded expression slipped just enough to reveal something more complicated underneath. How has it strengthened your kingdom exactly? She asked, genuinely curious. Kale finally looked up from his work, studying her for a moment before answering. The alphas who wished to force a marriage upon me intended to use that union to slowly gain influence over White Wolf affairs. By marrying you instead, I have denied them that opportunity entirely, while also gaining a wife whose own family's disgrace makes her far less likely to secretly serve any interests but her own. That is a very practical way of describing a marriage, Elira said, unable to keep a faint note of dry amusement from her voice. It is a practical marriage, Kale reminded her, though something in his tone had softened slightly. I did not think you expected otherwise. I did not, Elira admitted, but I find myself curious about the man behind all this careful practicality. Something flickered across Kale's expression, surprise perhaps, or a flicker of something more guarded, before he returned his attention to the reports on his desk, effectively ending the conversation. Elira did not press further, though the exchange stayed with her throughout the rest of the day, a small thread of curiosity she could not quite set aside. Life within the White Wolf Castle settled, slowly, into a strange new rhythm. Elira spent her mornings learning the laws and customs of her new kingdom from Kale's most trusted advisor, an elderly, sharp-eyed woman named Adeline, who seemed to view Elira with a mixture of skepticism and grudging patience. Her afternoons were often spent observing council meetings, standing quietly at Kale's side as he addressed disputes between pack members, trade negotiations with neighboring territories, and the occasional tense diplomatic exchange regarding border security. She found herself, much to her surprise, genuinely interested in the work, where her own pack had rarely included her in matters beyond social obligations and eventual marriage prospects. Kale made no effort to shield her from the realities of ruling a kingdom. If anything, he seemed to expect her full attention and understanding, correcting her gently when she misunderstood a law, explaining patiently when she asked questions about territorial disputes she did not yet fully grasp. "You expect a great deal from me," she said, one evening, after a particularly long council session concerning a border dispute with a smaller neighboring pack. "I expect you to understand the kingdom you now represent," Kale replied simply. "If something happens to me, you will be expected to rule in my place until a proper heir is established. I would rather you understand these matters thoroughly than remain ignorant of them." Elira considered this for a moment, surprised again by the practical, straightforward way he addressed even the most uncomfortable possibilities. "Most husbands would not think to prepare their wives for such a role," she said. "Most husbands did not marry a woman capable of handling it," Kale replied, and though his tone remained even, Elira caught the faint edge of genuine respect beneath the words. It was during the quiet evenings, after the day's formal obligations had ended, that Elira began to notice the smaller, more human moments hidden beneath Kale's carefully maintained composure. She noticed the way his shoulders would relax slightly once the council chamber emptied, the way his voice would soften almost imperceptibly when speaking with the younger pack members who occasionally sought his counsel, the rare flash of dry humor that would surface unexpectedly during otherwise serious conversations. She began to understand, slowly, that the cold, unforgiving king described in rumors was only a small part of the man she had married. A mask, perhaps, built out of necessity rather than truth. One evening, nearly a month into their marriage, Elira found Kale standing alone in the castle's training yard long after most of the household had retired for the night. He was not sparring, not practicing any particular technique, simply standing in the moonlight, his expression distant and troubled in a way she had not seen before. "You are awake late," she observed, stepping into the yard beside him. Kale glanced at her, something guarded flickering briefly across his face before settling back into its usual careful composure. "As are you," he replied. "I could not sleep," Elira admitted. "I saw the light out here and wondered who else might be sharing my restlessness." For a long moment, Kale said nothing, his gaze drifting back toward the moonlit trees beyond the training yard walls. "My father died in this yard," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "Betrayed by his own brother, who wanted the throne for himself. I was young when it happened, young enough that I still remember every detail of that night far more clearly than I would like." Elira's breath caught slightly, surprised by the sudden, unexpected vulnerability in his words. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not know." "Few people do," Cale said. "It is not something I speak of easily." "Why tell me now?" Elira asked, genuinely curious. Cale was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because you asked, once, about the man behind all this careful practicality," he said. "Perhaps it is only fair that you understand a little of why that practicality exists in the first place." Something warm and unexpected settled in Elira's chest at his words, a fragile thread of trust forming quietly between them in the moonlit stillness of the training yard. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling me." Cale studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, but somehow less guarded than usual. "You are not what I expected, Elira," he said finally. "When you first proposed this arrangement, I assumed I was gaining a convenient political ally. I did not expect." He stopped himself, seeming to reconsider his words carefully. "You did not expect what?" Elira pressed gently. "I did not expect to find myself curious about you as well," Cale admitted, his voice quieter than usual, carrying a note of something almost vulnerable beneath its careful measure. Elira felt her heart quicken unexpectedly at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the cool night air around them. "I did not expect that either," she admitted softly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stillness of the training yard settling comfortably around them, filled with the kind of unspoken understanding that neither of them had anticipated finding within a marriage, built entirely on practicality and strategy. Finally, Cale cleared his throat, stepping back slightly, the careful composure returning to his expression, though something in his eyes remained softer than before. "It grows late," he said. "You should rest, Elira." "As should you," she replied. He nodded, offering her a small, almost imperceptible smile, before turning to head back toward the castle. Elira watched him go, her thoughts lingering on the quiet vulnerability she had glimpsed beneath his careful composure, on the strange, unexpected warmth that had settled between them in the stillness of the moonlit yard. She realized, standing alone in the training yard, long after he had disappeared inside, that whatever this marriage had begun as, it was slowly becoming something far more complicated than either of them had originally intended. And though she was not yet ready to name the feeling growing quietly within her chest, she suspected, with a mixture of hope and uncertainty, that Cale Ashwinter was beginning to feel it too. Weeks passed, and the careful distance Elira and Cale had maintained at the beginning of their marriage began to soften into something quieter, steadier, and far more comfortable than either of them had anticipated. Their evenings, once filled with formal, guarded conversation, gradually shifted into something more relaxed. Shared meals discussing the day's events, quiet walks through the castle gardens, occasional moments of dry humor that surprised laughter out of Elira more often than she expected. She found herself, more and more, genuinely looking forward to these small moments together. It was during one such evening, as they walked together through the gardens after a particularly long and exhausting council session, that Elira noticed a messenger approaching from the direction of the main gate, moving with the kind of urgency that immediately set her nerves on edge. "A letter, Your Majesty," the messenger said, bowing slightly before Cale, and offering a sealed envelope. "It arrived by courier from Vantosh territory. It is addressed to Queen Elira." Elira's stomach tightened at the mention of her former home. She had received few letters from her family since the wedding, a handful of angry, disappointed messages from her father in the early weeks, followed by an increasingly cold silence as the months passed. She took the envelope carefully, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was from Wren. She excused herself from Cale's company, retreating to the privacy of her own chambers before opening the letter with trembling hands. The words within were hesitant, careful, clearly written and rewritten many times before being sent. Wren's letter spoke of regret, of confusion, of a bond that had formed against her own understanding or consent, in ways she still did not fully comprehend. She wrote of pressure from Corwin's mother, Lady Mira Dray, who had grown increasingly involved in arranging every aspect of Corwin and Wren's relationship since the disastrous wedding. She wrote of feeling trapped within a life she had never truly chosen, bound to a man whose family seemed far more interested in securing a stronger bloodline than in any genuine happiness for either of them. Alira read the letter twice, her emotions a tangled mixture of lingering hurt and unexpected, cautious sympathy. She had spent months trying not to think of her sister at all, trying to bury the pain of that betrayal beneath the growing responsibilities of her new life. But something in Ren's careful, uncertain words unsettled the careful walls she had built. She brought the letter to Cale later that evening, uncertain of what to do with the information it contained. "My sister believes she was manipulated into the bond with Corwin," she explained, handing him the letter. "She mentions his mother's involvement quite heavily. I do not know what to make of it." Cale read the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications. "Lady Mira Dreyer has a reputation," he said finally. "Ambitious, calculating, deeply invested in securing her family's influence through advantageous alliances. It would not surprise me if she played some role in accelerating whatever bond formed between your sister and Corwin." "You think it was intentional?" Alira asked, something cold settling in her stomach at the thought. "I think it is worth investigating," Cale said carefully. "True mate bonds are rare, and while they cannot be entirely manufactured, there are ways to encourage proximity, encourage circumstances that increase the likelihood of a bond forming between two people who might not have otherwise found each other." Alira sat with this information for a long moment, turning it over carefully in her mind. If what Cale suggested was true, then perhaps her sister's betrayal was not the simple, careless act of disloyalty Alira had believed it to be all these months. Perhaps Ren, too, had been a victim of circumstances entirely beyond her control. "I do not know what to do with this," Alira admitted quietly. "Part of me still feels the same anger I felt standing at that altar, but another part of me wonders if I judged her too harshly, without understanding the full truth of what happened." Cale studied her carefully, his expression softening slightly. "You do not have to decide anything tonight," he said, "but if you wish to learn more, I will support whatever path you choose to take." Alira felt a rush of gratitude at his words, at the quiet, steady support he offered, without hesitation or judgment. "Thank you," she said softly. Over the following weeks, Alira found herself corresponding cautiously with Ren, their letters slowly growing longer and more honest, as the careful walls between them began, tentatively, to lower. Ren described a life increasingly controlled by Lady Mira's expectations, a marriage arranged hastily after the scandal of the broken wedding, a growing sense of isolation within a family that seemed to value her only for the bond she carried rather than for who she was as a person. Alira, in turn, found herself sharing more of her own life as well, the challenges of learning to rule alongside Cale, the strange, unexpected comfort she had found within a marriage that had begun as nothing more than convenient strategy. It was during this same period that tensions along the border between Vantosh and White Wolf territory began to escalate. Reports arrived of increased patrols near the shared border, of subtle provocations from Vantosh scouts testing the boundaries of White Wolf land. Cale grew increasingly cautious, increasing security around the castle and border regions alike. "Corwin is testing us," Cale explained one evening, reviewing reports with his advisors gathered around the council table. "Whether out of genuine territorial ambition or simple resentment over your choice to marry me, I cannot yet say. But we must be prepared regardless." Alira felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach at the mention of Corwin's name. Though months had passed since the disastrous wedding, the wound of that betrayal had never fully healed, only settled into something quieter, more manageable, beneath the growing complexity of her new life. "Do you believe he intends real conflict?" she asked. "I believe he intends to reassert whatever pride your departure damaged," Cale said carefully. "Whether that ambition grows into something more dangerous remains to be seen." As the weeks passed, the tension along the border continued to build, small skirmishes between scouting patrols growing increasingly frequent, each side accusing the other of provocation. Alira found herself drawn more deeply into the strategic discussions surrounding the growing conflict, her earlier lessons in diplomacy and territorial law proving increasingly valuable as she offered insight into her former pack's likely motivations and strategies. Throughout it all, her bond with Cale continued to deepen in ways neither of them had anticipated at the start of their marriage. Their evening conversations grew longer, more personal, filled with quiet moments of genuine connection that neither of them had expected to find within an arrangement built on strategy rather than affection. One evening, as they stood together on the same balcony where they had first begun to open up to one another months earlier, Alira found herself studying Cale's profile in the moonlight, struck suddenly by how natural his presence beside her had become, how comfortable the silence between them felt compared to the anxious uncertainty of their earliest days together. "You are staring," Cale observed, a faint note of amusement in his voice, though he did not look away from the moonlit forest stretched before them. "I am thinking," Alira corrected, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "About what?" "About how strange it is," she said honestly, "that a marriage which began as nothing more than a practical arrangement has become something I genuinely look forward to each day." Cale turned to face her then, his expression more open and unguarded than she had ever seen it. "I find myself thinking the same thing," he admitted quietly, "more often than I expected to." Something warm and fragile passed between them in that moment, unspoken but deeply felt. A quiet acknowledgement of the growing bond neither of them had anticipated finding within their careful, strategic marriage. Neither of them spoke further of it that evening, the moment settling instead into a comfortable, companionable silence beneath the moonlit sky. But as Alira finally retired to her chambers later that night, she found herself smiling softly to herself, aware, for the first time since the disaster of her first wedding, of a quiet, growing hope for the future she had not expected to feel again so soon. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile hope would be tested by the growing tension building steadily along the border, nor how soon she would be forced to face Corwin and her sister once again, this time not as a grieving bride, but as the queen of the White Wolves. The formal request arrived on a cold morning, carried by a Vantosh messenger who refused to meet Alira's eyes as he delivered the sealed letter into Cale's hands. Alira watched her husband's expression carefully as he read through the contents, his jaw tightening slightly before he finally set the letter down on the council table. "Your former pack requests a formal council," Cale said, his voice carefully neutral, "to discuss the growing tension along our shared border and, apparently, to renegotiate terms of peaceful coexistence between our territories." Alira felt her stomach tighten immediately. "Corwin will be there," she said. It was not a question. "As the heir to the Dre pack and your father's closest ally, it would be unusual for him not to attend," Cale confirmed, watching her carefully for her reaction. "You do not have to attend this council yourself, Alira. I can represent our territory alone if you would prefer to avoid the confrontation." Alira considered this for a long moment, old anxieties warring with a newer, steadier resolve that had grown within her over the months of her marriage. She had spent so long avoiding thoughts of Corwin, of the wedding, of the humiliation that had defined the worst day of her life, but she was no longer the same woman who had fled through the forest in a torn wedding gown, uncertain and heartbroken. "No," she said finally, her voice steady. "I will attend. I am queen of the White Wolves now. I will not hide from my own former pack simply because facing them is difficult." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like quiet pride flickering across his expression. "Very well," he said. "We will attend together." The council was arranged to take place at a neutral location along the border, a large ceremonial tent erected specifically for the occasion, with representatives from both territories seated on opposite sides of a long wooden table. As Alira entered the tent beside Cale, dressed in the formal silver and blue colors of the White Wolf Kingdom, she felt every eye in the room shift toward her, a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and lingering resentment radiating from the Vantosh delegation seated across from her. Her father sat near the head of the Vantosh table, his expression carefully composed, though Alira caught the flicker of something complicated in his eyes as he studied his daughter dressed in the colors of their oldest rival. Beside him sat Corwin, his posture stiff and formal, and beside Corwin, looking pale and uncertain in a gown that did little to hide the visible signs of the mating mark still present on her neck, sat Ren. Alira held her sister's gaze for a long moment, and for the first time since the disastrous wedding, she saw something genuine in Ren's expression, not guilt alone, but something closer to relief, as if simply seeing her sister again after months of careful, hesitant letters brought a measure of comfort she had not expected. The council began formally, with representatives from both territories outlining their concerns regarding the escalating tension along the shared border. Elira listened carefully, offering measured, thoughtful contributions when appropriate, her earlier months of careful study proving invaluable, as she navigated the complex political discussions with a confidence that seemed to genuinely surprise several members of the Vantosh delegation. It was Corwin who eventually shifted the conversation toward more personal territory. "Perhaps," he said, his tone carrying a subtle edge of challenge, "some of this tension could be resolved more easily if certain personal matters were addressed honestly, rather than allowed to fester beneath diplomatic formality." Elira felt Cale tense slightly beside her, though his expression remained carefully composed. "I am not certain what personal matters you are referring to," Cale said evenly. "I believe you understand perfectly well," Corwin replied, his gaze flickering toward Elira. "Your marriage to my former fiancé has caused considerable strain between our territories. Among my council, believe it was arranged out of nothing more than spite, a reckless decision made in the heat of a painful moment, rather than genuine strategic consideration." Elira felt a flash of anger rise within her, sharp and immediate, but she forced herself to remain composed, drawing on the lessons in careful diplomacy she had spent months learning. "My marriage to King Cale was a decision made with full clarity and purpose," she said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. "I would ask that you refrain from speculating about motivations you do not understand." "Forgive me," Corwin said, though his tone carried no genuine apology. "It simply seems curious that a marriage built on such sudden circumstances has proven so remarkably stable in the months since. One might almost suspect there is more to the arrangement than simple political convenience." Elira's cheeks flushed slightly at the implication in his words, though whether from anger or something closer to embarrassment at how accurately he had guessed the truth, she could not fully determine. Beside her, Cale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Whatever exists between myself and my wife," Cale said, his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous edge that Elira had rarely heard from him before, "is not a matter open for discussion in this council. We are here to address the security of our shared border, not to speculate about the nature of my marriage." Corwin held Cale's gaze for a long moment, something tense and unspoken passing between the two men, before he finally inclined his head slightly, conceding the point, though the tension in the room remained palpable. The council continued for several more hours, addressing border security measures, trade agreements, and the establishment of clearer boundaries to prevent further skirmishes between patrol scouts. Throughout the proceedings, Elira remained acutely aware of Wren's presence across the table, of the careful, uncertain glances her sister continued to send her way, of the growing sense that there was far more happening within the Dre household than the formal council setting allowed either of them to discuss openly. As the council finally drew to a close, and the various delegations began preparing to depart, Elira found a brief moment to approach her sister privately, drawing her aside from the gathering crowd near the tent's entrance. "Wren," she said quietly, "we need to speak, away from all of this." Wren's eyes widened slightly, a mixture of hope and apprehension crossing her features. "I would like that," she whispered. "There is so much I need to explain, Elira. So much I did not understand myself until it was already far too late." "Not here," Elira said, glancing toward where Corwin stood speaking with several members of his own delegation, his attention thankfully occupied elsewhere. "Send word when you are able to meet privately. I will find a way to arrange it safely." Wren nodded quickly, her expression carrying a fragile, cautious relief. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being willing to listen, after everything." Elira squeezed her sister's hand briefly before releasing it, watching as Wren returned to Corwin's side, her posture once again carefully composed, the brief moment of genuine connection between them, hidden once more beneath the formal masks required by their respective positions. As Elira and Cale made their way back toward White Wolf territory, following the council's conclusion, she found herself replaying Corwin's earlier words in her mind, the subtle challenge in his tone, the barely concealed resentment beneath his carefully diplomatic phrasing. "He is not finished," she said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them during the journey home. "Corwin, whatever game he is playing, this council was only the beginning." Kale's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I agree," he said. His comments regarding our marriage were not simple idle speculation. He is testing the stability of our alliance, likely hoping to find some crack he can exploit. "Do you think he suspects the truth?" Elira asked carefully, "about what has grown between us?" Kale glanced at her then, something warm and complicated flickering across his expression before he answered. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever exists between us has become far too significant to remain hidden much longer, regardless of what Corwin does or does not suspect." Elira felt her heart quicken at his words, at the quiet acknowledgement of a truth neither of them had yet spoken aloud directly. "Kale," she began softly, uncertain of exactly what she intended to say next. But before she could continue, a sharp, urgent call rang out from one of the scouts riding ahead of their convoy, cutting through the quiet evening air with unmistakable alarm. "Riders approaching from the eastern ridge, unknown affiliation, moving quickly toward our position." Kale's expression shifted immediately, all traces of warmth replaced by sharp, focused alertness, as he reached instinctively for the sword secured at his side. "Stay close to me," he said to Elira, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever this is, we face it together." Elira nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, as she watched the unfamiliar riders draw closer along the ridge. The peaceful resolution of the council meeting shattered in an instant by the sudden, unexpected threat now bearing down upon them. The riders emerged from the tree line with alarming speed, their formation tight and deliberate, moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning, rather than a random encounter. Elira's pulse hammered, as she counted at least a dozen figures approaching, their faces obscured by dark hoods, bearing no visible markings that identified their allegiance to any known pack. "Ambush riders," Kale said sharply, positioning himself between Elira and the approaching threat. "Someone wanted this convoy intercepted before we returned safely to White Wolf territory." The White Wolf guards accompanying their convoy moved quickly into defensive positions, forming a protective barrier around Elira and Kale as the unknown riders closed the remaining distance. Elira felt fear coil tightly in her chest, but beneath it, something steadier and more determined took hold as she watched Kale assess the threat with the same calm, calculated focus he brought to every council decision. "They outnumber our immediate guard," Kale said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "But we have the advantage of position. Stay behind me, and if the fighting reaches us directly, do not hesitate to defend yourself." Elira nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the small ceremonial dagger she had taken to carrying since her earliest days as queen, a gift from Adeline who had insisted no ruler of the White Wolf Kingdom should ever travel unarmed. The riders closed the final distance, and the first clash of steel rang out sharply through the evening air as White Wolf guards moved to intercept the attacking force. Elira watched, her heart pounding, as Kale shifted seamlessly into his wolf form, his massive white shape moving with lethal grace as he engaged two of the attacking riders simultaneously, driving them back from the convoy with powerful, controlled strikes. The battle was brief but fierce, the White Wolf guards proving far more disciplined and prepared than their attackers had anticipated. Within minutes, several of the unknown riders lay incapacitated, while the remainder began a hasty, disorganized retreat back toward the eastern ridge from which they had emerged. As the last of the attackers disappeared into the tree line, Kale shifted back into his human form, breathing heavily, a shallow wound visible along his forearm, where one of the attackers had managed to land a glancing blow before being driven back. "Kale." Elira rushed toward him immediately, her earlier fear replaced by urgent concern as she examined the wound carefully. "You are injured." "It is minor," Kale said, though his expression tightened slightly as she gently probed the edges of the wound. "We need to question the captured riders before we tend to anything else. I want to know who sent them." The White Wolf guards had managed to capture two of the retreating riders, dragging them forward roughly to kneel before Kale and Elira. Under Kale's sharp, unrelenting questioning, one of the captured men finally broke, admitting reluctantly that they had been hired anonymously, paid handsomely to intercept the royal convoy and create the appearance of a border skirmish gone wrong. "Who hired you?" Kale demanded, his voice carrying a dangerous edge Elira had never heard from him before. "I do not know his name," the captured man stammered, clearly terrified. Only that he was Vantosh, well-dressed, spoke with authority. "He paid us to make it look as though White Wolf guards had provoked the attack, to stir further conflict between the territories." Elira felt a cold, sinking realization settle in her stomach as she processed the implications of the man's confession. "Corwin," she said quietly, meeting Cale's gaze. "We cannot be certain," Cale said carefully, though his own expression carried clear suspicion. "But the timing, immediately following a council meeting, where he made pointed remarks about our marriage, is difficult to ignore." They returned to White Wolf territory that evening, in tense, watchful silence, the captured riders secured for further questioning, Cale's wound tended carefully by the castle healers, despite his insistence that it required little attention. Elira remained at his side throughout the process, her earlier fear during the ambush settling into a fierce, protective determination she had not expected to feel so strongly. Over the following days, word of the ambush spread quickly through both territories, though the narrative surrounding the incident grew increasingly distorted with each retelling. Reports reaching White Wolf territory suggested that rumors were circulating within Vantosh lands, claiming that the entire ambush had been staged by Cale himself, an elaborate scheme intended to justify further military buildup along the border under the guise of legitimate defense. "It is absurd," Elira said furiously, reading through one particularly inflammatory report during a council meeting. "Anyone who witnessed the attack knows exactly what happened. Why would anyone believe such an obvious lie?" "Because the lie serves a purpose," Adeline said grimly from her seat near the council table. "Someone within Vantosh territory wants to paint King Cale as the aggressor, to justify whatever actions they intend to take next." Cale's expression remained carefully composed, though Elira could see the tension building beneath his controlled exterior. "Corwin is attempting to undermine our credibility," he said. "If enough people believe the ambush was staged, it weakens our position significantly, both diplomatically and militarily. There is more," one of the council advisors added carefully, glancing toward Elira with obvious hesitation. "The rumors do not stop at questioning the ambush itself. There are whispers circulating that Queen Elira's marriage to King Cale was never a genuine strategic alliance at all, but rather an act of pure spite, meant only to humiliate her former fiancé. Some are suggesting the marriage remains unstable, vulnerable to collapse given the right pressure." Elira felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment at the implication, the careful, growing bond she and Cale had built together being reduced to nothing more than petty scandal within the rumors spreading across both territories. "That is not true," she said firmly. "Whatever this marriage began as, it has become something far more significant than spite or convenience." "I know that," Cale said quietly, meeting her gaze with a steady, reassuring warmth that helped settle some of the anxiety building within her chest. "But Corwin does not need the rumors to be true. He only needs them to spread widely enough to create doubt, both within our own kingdom and among the wider political landscape observing our alliance." Elira considered this carefully, old anxieties resurfacing alongside newer, more complicated feelings she had not yet fully acknowledged, even to herself. She thought of the quiet moments shared with Cale on the castle balcony, of the growing warmth and trust that had developed steadily between them over the months of their marriage. She thought of how easily that fragile, precious connection could be undermined by carefully orchestrated rumors and political maneuvering. "We cannot allow him to succeed," she said finally, her voice carrying a fierce determination that surprised even herself. "Whatever Corwin intends with these rumors, whatever game he is playing, we need to respond, decisively and publicly, to protect both our alliance and the stability of this kingdom." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like quiet pride and genuine warmth flickering across his expression. "What do you propose?" he asked. Elira took a steadying breath, an idea beginning to form clearly in her mind. "A public declaration," she said. "Not simply a denial of the rumors, but a clear, undeniable demonstration of the strength and legitimacy of our alliance. Something that leaves no room for doubt or speculation." "And what might that demonstration involve?" Cale asked, curiosity evident in his tone. Before Elira could answer, One of the castle guards entered the council chamber hurriedly, his expression urgent. "Your Majesties," he said, bowing quickly. "A message has arrived. Reports indicate a larger force is gathering along the eastern border, believed to be organized under the direct authority of Corwin Dre. It appears preparations are being made for a coordinated assault against White Wolf territory within the coming days." The council chamber fell into tense, immediate silence as the weight of the guard's words settled over everyone present. Illyra exchanged a sharp, urgent glance with Kale, the earlier discussion of rumors and diplomatic strategy suddenly overshadowed by the far more immediate and dangerous threat of open conflict looming just beyond their borders. "Gather the full council," Kale said, his voice sharp and commanding, all traces of earlier warmth replaced by the focused, decisive authority of a king preparing his kingdom for war. "We need every available guard prepared, and I want updated reports on troop movements within the hour." As the council chamber erupted into urgent activity around her, Illyra felt a cold, steady resolve settle over her own uncertainty. Whatever fragile hope she had begun to build for her future within White Wolf territory, whatever quiet, growing feelings had developed between herself and Kale over the months of their marriage, all of it now stood threatened by the looming shadow of a conflict that Corwin seemed determined to force upon them. She would not allow him to destroy what she had built here, not without a fight. The following days passed in a blur of urgent preparation. White Wolf territory mobilized quickly, guards stationed along every vulnerable point of the border, scouts sent out in careful rotations to monitor the growing force gathering just beyond Vantosh lines. Illyra found herself working alongside Kale almost constantly, reviewing defensive strategies, coordinating supply lines, and offering insight into her former pack's likely tactics based on years of familiarity with their military traditions. "They will not attack directly through the main pass," Illyra said one evening, studying a detailed map spread across the council table. "My father always favored flanking maneuvers, drawing attention toward one point, while the true assault came from an unexpected direction." Kale studied the map carefully, tracing the terrain with a thoughtful expression. "If that is true, then Corwin will likely attempt to push through the northern ridge, using the dense forest cover to mask his true numbers until the last possible moment." "That would be my assumption as well," Illyra agreed. Kale glanced up at her, something like genuine admiration flickering across his expression. "Your insight has proven invaluable throughout this entire preparation," he said. "I do not think I fully appreciated, when we first agreed to this arrangement, exactly how capable a partner I had gained." Illyra felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, a warmth that had grown steadily more difficult to ignore over the recent weeks of shared crisis and careful strategy. "We make a good team," she said softly. "We do," Kale agreed, his voice carrying a quiet sincerity that made her heart quicken. The attack came 3 days later, under the cover of early morning fog, exactly as Illyra had predicted. Vantosh forces pushed through the northern ridge in significant numbers, their approach masked initially by the thick mist rolling through the forest, though White Wolf scouts had anticipated the maneuver and raised the alarm well before the attacking force reached the castle's outer defenses. Illyra stood beside Kale as the defensive lines formed quickly along the northern approach, the cold morning air thick with tension and the distant sound of approaching forces. Despite Kale's initial insistence that she remain safely within the castle during the confrontation, Illyra had refused firmly, arguing that her knowledge of Vantosh tactics made her presence on the field a genuine strategic advantage rather than an unnecessary risk. "Stay close," Kale said, his expression tight with concern despite his earlier agreement to allow her presence. "Whatever happens, I need you safe." "I intend to stay exactly that," Illyra replied, though her own nerves hummed with a mixture of fear and fierce determination as the first shapes of the attacking force emerged from the fog ahead. The battle that followed was chaotic and fierce, White Wolf guards meeting the Vantosh assault with disciplined precision, honed through days of careful preparation. Illyra remained near the rear of the defensive formation as instructed, coordinating messages between different sections of the battle line, her earlier strategic insight proving genuinely valuable as the conflict unfolded exactly as she had predicted. It was during the height of the confrontation, as a smaller contingent of Vantosh soldiers attempted a flanking maneuver around the eastern edge of the battle line, that Elira found herself suddenly exposed, cut off from the main body of White Wolf guards by the shifting chaos of combat. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, to find 3 Vantosh soldiers advancing directly toward her position, clearly recognizing her royal status and seeing an opportunity to capture or eliminate a significant strategic target. Fear flooded through her, sharp and immediate, but beneath it, the fierce determination that had carried her through months of careful preparation held steady. She drew the ceremonial dagger from her belt, positioning herself defensively as the soldiers closed the distance. "Elira!" Kale's voice cut sharply through the chaos of battle, and within moments, his massive white wolf form appeared beside her, moving with lethal speed to intercept the advancing soldiers before they could reach her. He fought with a ferocity Elira had never witnessed before, driven by something far more powerful than simple strategic necessity, his movements carrying an intensity that spoke of pure, protective instinct. As the last of the 3 soldiers fell back, retreating hastily from Kale's overwhelming defense, he shifted quickly back into his human form, moving immediately to Elira's side, his expression carrying a raw, unguarded fear she had never seen from him before. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands moving instinctively to check for any sign of injury. "I am fine," Elira assured him, though her own voice trembled slightly with the lingering adrenaline of the near encounter. "Kale, I am fine." For a long moment, they simply stood there amid the chaos of the ongoing battle, Kale's hands still resting gently against her shoulders, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. And then, without conscious thought, without careful consideration of timing or circumstance, something shifted between them, powerful and undeniable. A warmth unlike anything Elira had ever experienced surged through her chest, spreading rapidly through her entire body, accompanied by an overwhelming, instinctive certainty that settled deep into her very core. She felt Kale's presence beside her, with a clarity that went beyond simple physical awareness, felt a connection forming between them that was unmistakably, undeniably real. Kale's breath caught sharply, his eyes widening slightly, as the same sensation clearly settled over him as well. "Elira," he breathed, his voice carrying a note of stunned wonder beneath the urgency of the ongoing battle around them. "Do you feel that?" "Yes," Elira whispered, her hand rising instinctively to press against her own chest, where the warmth of the forming bond continued to spread steadily outward. "I feel it." The mating bond, the same connection she had once witnessed forming between Corwin and her own sister at the altar, was now forming between herself and Kale, undeniable and complete, sealing a truth that neither of them had been prepared to fully acknowledge until this exact, chaotic moment. There was no time to process the full weight of what had just occurred between them, the ongoing battle demanding their immediate attention once again, as the sounds of combat continued to echo around the battlefield. Kale's expression shifted quickly back into focused determination, though something new and fiercely protective had settled permanently into his gaze as he positioned himself once again between Elira and the ongoing conflict. "We finish this," he said, his voice carrying renewed strength and purpose, "and then we address everything else." Elira nodded, her own resolve steadied by the powerful new connection humming steadily beneath her ribs, by the undeniable certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them now, bound irrevocably to the man beside her, not simply through strategy or convenience, but through something far deeper and far more permanent. The battle continued for another hour before the Vantosh forces, having failed to achieve their intended flanking maneuver and facing increasingly disciplined resistance from White Wolf defenders, began a gradual, organized retreat back toward their own territory. As the last of the attacking soldiers disappeared back across the border, a tense, uncertain quiet settled over the battlefield, the immediate threat resolved, though the larger conflict clearly far from finished. Kale turned to Elira amid the settling aftermath of battle, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief, exhaustion, and the same fierce wonder that had settled over him in the moment their bond had formed. "We survived," he said softly. "We did," Elira agreed, stepping closer to him instinctively, drawn by the powerful new connection humming steadily between them. Cale reached out, his hand rising gently to cup her face, his thumb tracing softly along her cheek. "I do not know how to explain what has happened between us," he admitted quietly, "but I know that whatever this connection is, I do not wish to fight against it." "Neither do I," Illyra whispered, leaning slightly into his touch, the warmth of their newly formed bond settling comfortably around her, like something she had been searching for her entire life, without fully realizing it. As the White Wolf guards began the careful process of tending to the wounded and securing the battlefield around them, Cale and Illyra remained standing together amid the settling chaos, bound now by something far more powerful than the practical arrangement that had first brought them together, facing an uncertain future together, with a newfound strength neither of them had anticipated finding within the ashes of a battle meant to tear them apart. In the days following the battle, White Wolf territory settled into a careful, watchful calm, though the underlying tension with Vantosh lands remained far from resolved. Cale increased security along the border significantly, while Illyra found herself increasingly preoccupied with the fate of her sister, still trapped within a household that had grown more dangerous and controlling with each passing month. A letter arrived unexpectedly one afternoon, delivered not through the usual formal channels, but smuggled discreetly through a trusted servant who had once served within the Vantosh household before transferring to White Wolf territory years earlier. The letter was from Ren, and its contents were far more urgent and revealing than anything she had shared in her previous correspondence. Illyra read through the letter with growing horror, Cale standing quietly beside her, his own expression darkening steadily as she relayed the contents aloud. Ren wrote of finally uncovering the full truth behind her bond with Corwin, a truth she had only recently pieced together after months of quiet, careful investigation within her own household. Lady Mira Dre, Corwin's ambitious mother, had indeed played a direct and deliberate role in engineering the circumstances that led to the formation of the mating bond between Ren and Corwin. According to Ren's careful research, Lady Mira had discovered, through her extensive knowledge of ancient pack bonding rituals, a series of specific herbs and prolonged proximity techniques that could significantly increase the likelihood of a mate bond forming between two individuals who might not have otherwise found each other naturally. She had orchestrated countless private encounters between Ren and Corwin in the months leading up to Illyra's original wedding, carefully manipulating circumstances to ensure the bond would form before the ceremony could be completed. Her motivation, Ren explained, stemmed from her belief that Ren, being younger and more easily influenced than Illyra, would prove a far more compliant and controllable addition to the Dre family bloodline. Illyra's independent spirit and growing political awareness had made her a less desirable match in Lady Mira's calculating assessment, despite the original alliance being arranged specifically between Illyra and Corwin. "She manipulated the entire situation," Illyra said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief as she finished reading the letter. "My sister was manipulated into a bond she never truly chose, all so that Lady Mira could secure a more compliant daughter-in-law." Cale's expression had grown increasingly dark throughout Illyra's explanation, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. "This changes everything," he said finally. "If we can prove Lady Mira's manipulation, it exposes not only the true nature of your sister's forced bond, but likely much of Corwin's recent aggressive behavior as well. It is entirely possible that Lady Mira has been directing his actions regarding the border conflicts as well, using her son's position to further consolidate her own family's influence." Illyra considered this carefully, a plan beginning to form slowly within her mind. "Ren mentions in her letter that she has gathered some physical evidence," she said, reading further into the letter's contents. "Records of herb purchases, correspondence between Lady Mira and several individuals skilled in ancient bonding rituals. If we can secure this evidence and bring it before a full council, both Vantosh and White Wolf representatives together, we could expose the truth publicly." "It would be dangerous," Cale said carefully. "If Lady Mira suspects Ren is gathering evidence against her, there is no telling what she might do to prevent that information from reaching the wider council." "I know," Illyra said, her expression hardening with determination. "But my sister has been trapped within that household for months, manipulated and controlled by a woman who saw her only as a useful tool for securing greater influence. I will not leave her there any longer than necessary. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like fierce respect and quiet pride flickering across his expression. Then we will find a way to help her, he said firmly. Together. Over the following days, Illyra and Cale worked carefully to arrange a secure method of extracting Ren from the Vantosh household, coordinating discreetly through trusted intermediaries to avoid drawing suspicion from Lady Mira or her extensive network of informants. It was a delicate, dangerous process, requiring careful timing and absolute discretion to ensure both Ren's safety and the preservation of the evidence she had gathered. Finally, under the cover of a planned diplomatic visit meant to discuss further border security measures, Illyra arranged a private meeting with Ren, using the formal pretense of discussing family matters to create an opportunity for genuine, unmonitored conversation between the sisters for the first time since the devastating wedding months earlier. They met within a small, private chamber adjacent to the main council hall, the door carefully secured to prevent any unwelcome interruptions. Ren looked considerably thinner than Illyra remembered, dark shadows evident beneath her eyes, her posture carrying the weight of months spent trapped within an increasingly controlling and manipulative household. Illyra, Ren said softly, tears immediately welling in her eyes as she embraced her sister tightly. I am so sorry, for everything. I did not understand, not truly, until it was already far too late. I know, Illyra said gently, holding her sister close, old anger softening into genuine, protective sympathy as she felt the trembling uncertainty still present within Ren's embrace. I have read your letters. I understand now what truly happened. Ren pulled back slightly, wiping at her tears as she reached into a small hidden pocket, sewn carefully into the lining of her gown, producing a small, carefully folded collection of documents. This is everything I have gathered, she said quietly. Records of the herbs Lady Mira purchased, letters exchanged with a ritual specialist from the Eastern Territories, even a private journal entry where she explicitly discusses her intentions regarding the bond she planned to manufacture between myself and Corwin. Illyra took the documents carefully, scanning through the damning evidence with growing certainty that they finally possessed exactly what was needed to expose the truth publicly. This is more than enough, she said. Ren, this evidence could change everything. Not only for you, but potentially for the entire conflict currently threatening both our territories. What do we do now? Ren asked, her expression carrying a fragile mixture of hope and lingering fear. We bring this before a full council, Illyra said firmly. Both Vantosh and White Wolf representatives together, along with any other regional leaders whose alliances have been affected by the growing conflict. We expose Lady Mira's manipulation publicly, and we free you from whatever obligations she has forced upon you through deception. Ren's eyes widened slightly at the boldness of the plan. Corwin's family will not accept this without significant resistance, she warned. Lady Mira wields considerable influence within our pack. Exposing her manipulation publicly will not be a simple matter. I am aware of the risks, Illyra said steadily, but I am no longer willing to allow fear of Lady Mira's influence to control either of our futures. You deserve the chance to build a life free of her manipulation. Ren, just as I have found within my own marriage. Something shifted in Ren's expression at her sister's words, a growing determination replacing the earlier fragile uncertainty. Then let us do this together, she said firmly. Sisters, standing united, rather than divided by circumstances neither of us truly chose. Illyra felt a warm, fierce sense of solidarity settle within her chest, the old wound of betrayal finally beginning to heal as she and her sister stood together, united once again, against a threat far greater than the simple misunderstanding that had once torn them apart. Together, Illyra agreed, squeezing her sister's hand firmly. We will need to move carefully and quickly before Lady Mira suspects what we intend. But together, I believe we can finally expose the truth and free both our futures from her manipulation once and for all. As the sisters finalized their careful plan, neither of them fully anticipating just how dramatically the coming confrontation would reshape the fragile political balance between their two territories, a quiet, determined hope settled steadily between them, the first genuine warmth they had shared since the disaster of that fateful wedding so many months earlier. The full council convened 2 weeks later, held once again within the same neutral ceremonial tent that had hosted the earlier, tense negotiations between Vantosh and White Wolf territories. This time, however, representatives from several additional regional pacts had been invited to attend, drawn by careful, deliberate invitations sent by Kale, specifically to ensure the widest possible audience for the truth about to be revealed. Alira stood beside Kale as the council formally opened, her heart pounding steadily, despite the calm, composed expression she maintained. Across the table, her father sat beside Corwin, and beside Corwin, Lady Mira Dre herself, dressed in elaborate finery, her expression carrying the confident, controlled authority of a woman entirely unaware of the evidence about to be presented against her. Ren sat quietly beside Alira, dressed simply, but with a newfound confidence Alira had not seen in her sister since long before the wedding, the fragile uncertainty of previous months, replaced by steady, determined resolve. The council began with formal discussions regarding the recent border conflicts, various representatives offering careful assessments of the escalating tensions between the two territories. It was during a natural pause in these initial proceedings that Alira rose from her seat, drawing the attention of the entire assembled council. "Before we continue discussing the surface conflicts between our territories," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the tent, "I believe there is a deeper truth that must be addressed, one that I believe explains much of the tension that has developed over these past months." Lady Mira's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of wariness crossing her otherwise composed features. "What truth might that be, Queen Alira?" she asked, her tone carrying a subtle edge of challenge. "The truth," Alira said steadily, "regarding the formation of the mating bond between my sister, Ren, and Corwin Dre." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the assembled council members, and Alira watched carefully as her father's expression shifted from confusion to growing alarm, while Corwin's face paled slightly, his gaze flickering nervously toward his mother. "That bond formed naturally," Lady Mira said quickly, though a slight edge of tension had entered her voice. "As true mate bonds always do. There is nothing further to discuss." "Is that true?" Alira asked, turning deliberately toward her sister. "Ren, would you care to share what you have discovered?" Ren rose slowly from her seat, her hands trembling slightly, though her voice remained steady as she addressed the full council. "For months, I believed exactly what everyone else believed," she said. "That my bond with Corwin had formed naturally, as an unavoidable act of fate, but I have since discovered evidence suggesting otherwise." She produced the carefully gathered documents, distributing copies to several of the regional representatives seated around the table. These records show detailed purchases of specific herbs known to increase proximity-based bonding likelihood, purchased repeatedly by Lady Mira Dre in the months leading up to my sister's original wedding, alongside correspondence with a ritual specialist from the Eastern Territories, discussing methods for encouraging bond formation between two specific individuals. The council chamber erupted into stunned murmurs as the assembled representatives began reviewing the damning documents. Lady Mira's composed expression finally cracked, her face flushing with a mixture of anger and panic as she realized the extent of the evidence gathered against her. "This is fabricated," she said sharply, though her voice carried far less conviction than her earlier confident dismissal. "Baseless accusations, likely orchestrated by Queen Alira herself, seeking petty revenge for a wedding that ended in her own embarrassment." "I have witnessed testimony as well," Ren continued firmly, undeterred by Lady Mira's accusations, "from servants within our household who observed Lady Mira personally arranging countless private encounters between myself and Corwin in the weeks leading up to Alira's wedding, always under carefully constructed circumstances, designed to maximize proximity and encourage bond formation." Alaric Vantosh rose slowly from his seat, his expression a mixture of horror and growing anger as he studied the evidence spread before him. "Is this true, Corwin?" he demanded, turning sharply toward the younger man. "Did your mother manipulate the formation of your bond with my daughter?" Corwin's expression carried genuine shock, his composure finally breaking as the weight of his mother's manipulation became fully clear to him as well. "I did not know," he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine disbelief. "I truly believed the bond had formed naturally. Mother, is this true?" Lady Mira's expression hardened, recognizing the impossibility of maintaining her earlier denials in the face of such overwhelming evidence and her own son's growing suspicion. "I did what was necessary," she said finally, her voice carrying a cold, unapologetic edge, "to secure the strongest possible future for our family's bloodline." Illyra's independent nature made her a less desirable match. Ren's compliance made her far more suitable for the role our family required. A heavy, stunned silence settled over the council chamber as Lady Mira's admission confirmed the full extent of her manipulation. Illyra felt a fierce, protective satisfaction settle within her chest as she watched the truth finally exposed publicly, the manipulation that had shattered her original wedding and trapped her sister within an unwanted bond, finally laid bare before the full council. "This deception," Cale said, rising to stand beside Illyra, his voice carrying the calm, commanding authority of a king fully in control of the situation, "has caused significant harm, not only to Queen Illyra and her sister, but to the broader stability between our territories." Lady Mira's manipulation directly contributed to the humiliation of Queen Illyra's original wedding, the forced bonding of an unwilling participant, and very likely the escalating aggression along our shared border, driven by resentment and misdirection rather than genuine strategic necessity. The assembled regional representatives began discussing the implications of the revealed manipulation amongst themselves, several expressing clear outrage at the deliberate deception uncovered before them. Alaric Vantosh, his expression carrying deep shame and regret, formally apologized to both his daughters before the full council, acknowledging his own failure to fully investigate the circumstances surrounding the original wedding disaster. In the following hour, the council reached a formal decision. Lady Mira Dre was stripped of her standing within the Vantosh Pack's political structure, her manipulation deemed a serious violation of pack law regarding forced bonding practices. Corwin, though absolved of direct responsibility for his mother's manipulation, formally released Ren from any remaining marital obligations, acknowledging that a bond built upon such deliberate deception could not be considered a legitimate foundation for continued marriage. Ren, finally free of the manipulation that had controlled her life for months, embraced Illyra tightly amid the stunned aftermath of the council's decision, tears of genuine relief streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for helping me find the truth." "We are sisters," Illyra said softly, holding Ren close. "Whatever happened between us, whatever manipulation drove us apart, that bond was always real, and it always will be." As the council slowly began to disperse, the regional representatives departing with renewed understanding of the true circumstances behind the border conflicts, Cale moved to stand beside Illyra, his expression carrying quiet pride and deep affection as he studied her. "You did something remarkable today," he said softly. "Not only did you expose the truth, but you freed your sister from a manipulation that could have controlled the rest of her life." "We did this together," Illyra corrected gently, "just as we have built everything else between us together." Cale reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a warmth that had grown steadily more natural over the months since their bond had formed. "I did not expect, when you first proposed our marriage as nothing more than a strategic arrangement, that it would lead us here," he admitted quietly. "Neither did I," Illyra said, smiling softly as she looked out over the dispersing council, the border conflict finally resolved, her sister freed from manipulation, her own place as Queen of the White Wolves more secure than ever before. "But I would not trade this life for anything else." In the months that followed, peace slowly returned to the border between Vantosh and White Wolf territory, the earlier tensions dissolved by the public exposure of Lady Mira's manipulation and the genuine reconciliation between both packs' leadership. Ren, freed from her forced bond, returned gradually to her own sense of self, eventually finding genuine happiness within her own life, no longer defined by the manipulation that had once controlled her future. Illyra, standing firmly in her role as Queen of the White Wolves, found herself continually amazed by the life she had built from the ashes of her original, devastating wedding day. What had begun as a desperate strategic decision to escape a life of diminished expectations had grown into something far more profound than she had ever imagined possible. A genuine partnership built on mutual respect, growing affection, and ultimately, an unbreakable bond that no manipulation or betrayal could ever hope to undo. Standing once again on the familiar castle balcony, overlooking the moonlit forest, Kale's arm wrapped comfortably around her shoulders, Alira allowed herself a quiet, genuine smile, finally at peace with the unexpected path her life had taken. She had once stood at an altar, watching everything she believed about her future shatter in an instant. But from that shattering had emerged something far stronger, far more genuine, than anything she had originally hoped to find. She had not simply survived the betrayal that once threatened to destroy her. She had built, from its very ashes, an entirely new kingdom, and an entirely new life, exactly her own.